Hello, good morning. Welcome to the breakfast meeting here on NBS television. It is a beautiful Friday morning, and it's always exciting to be part of your mornings. It is always exciting for you to come and partake in our discussions. Previously, we were having a conversation on the Media Roundtable hosted by Solomon Teranja, looking at the issues that are affecting our everyday life, of course, the politics in and out of Kampala, and the journalist perspective within that regard. Our discussion this morning is looking at the phased reopening of schools and highlighting the emerging issues within that regard, if I may, as a result of the global outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic that left so many places in turmoil and other places in limbo. The government abruptly shut down many institutions in March last year. In March, if I may, the date was March 20th, 2020, and about 73,000 institutions of higher learning were closed. That affected 15 million learners. So the directive of the closure indicated that schools would resume a month later. And of course, indeed, after 2 weeks of closure, the Ministry of Education and Sports issued tentative dates for the reopening of schools. However, that was not the case due to the increased number of coronavirus patients, prompting the extension of the lockdown. During that particular period, there were private institutions and, of course, government-aided schools that tried to continue with the arrangement of teaching some of the students using social media. So some were using WhatsApp, Zoom, Google Teams, and the like to continue with learning material such that students aren't left behind. However, this was not the case for some, even as much as that was commendable, this was not the case for some other institutions that were unable to have access to some of these materials for learning. That way have been left behind. And now the schools have been reopened in a phased manner, starting with candidates and semi-candidate classes. But where does this leave those that were not part of that process, or possibly those that were in rural areas and have not been able to catch up with their friends? Would it be a fair balance? So this morning, our discussion will be highlighting the emerging issues from the phased reopening of schools, and of course to as well identify and examine the issues emerging from the phased reopening of schools. Joining me this morning for a more detailed discussion is a community outreach officer from Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, ISER, called Joshua Kisawuzi, to help us throw more light on that particular topic. Good morning, sir. How are you today?
Okay, good morning, viewers. As Isabel, thank you very much for that elaborate introduction.
You're welcome.
I'm called Joshua Kisawuzi from the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, ISER. We are based in Ntinda. We are addressing issues of social and economic rights. And socio-economic rights, these are the rights that you are entitled to because you are human. We are looking at health, education, but today we are discussing mainly education.
All right.
As you have said before, the outbreak of the coronavirus really affected the education a lot, but right now, as the government has started on the reopening of schools, as the organization we embarked on finding out exactly what's happening on ground as these children are going back to school. There are quite a number of issues we are able to find out. One of them is the increase in the number of teenage pregnancies. The number of children who are not able to go back at school because of pregnancy has increased in many schools. And there are also kids who are not able to go back to school because they found other more important issues and are no longer taking education very serious. They embarked on business, fishing, and doing business with as they do. There's also the lack of infrastructure. Much as we say few kids are back to school, but the issue of infrastructure is still a challenge. Remember, most of the schools we have are using wooden benches. Several schools we found that they have been eaten by termites and they have nowhere to sit. So we are looking at if these kids now go back to school, which means the issue of lack of infrastructure, especially the benches, is going to be a very big challenging issue. There are quite a number. There is an increase in the school fees. You see, much as there are only two classes that are back to school, the candidate and the semi-candidate, but several schools have taken this advantage to increase the tuition, to increase the fees, to hike. If you remember, fees is one of the biggest challenges that leading to dropout of many children in Uganda. But whenever you increase, even if you increase 10,000, still these kids can drop out. Because for you are in the town here. But what's happening in the villages where I do my work as a community outreach officer, poverty is extremely high. Even if you say 5,000, you may find a kid can drop out of the school. So several schools have increased. For example, there's one school which has raised money beyond the capacity of several children who were once in that school. Others have totally abolished the day section.
The boarding section?
Yeah, some abolished the day section, others abolished the boarding section. Because you remember there was a policy by the government, or directive by the government, that should the school be either day or boarding. But there are some schools, especially around Mukono there, that have opted for a boarding section. The directive is, even if you are there before, you are supposed to enroll for boarding. You remember, if you cannot afford boarding, it means you can't afford the cost. So when you force such a kid to become a boarder, automatically several have dropped out of school because they can't afford. One school, a day scholar was charging 380,000 day, but in the boarding it was 860,000. This implies this day kid, if you tell him to join boarding, we have increased money, automatically has to drop out of school. So as an organization, we don't like that. And there are several other emerging issues. The issue of pregnancy is not yet solved. It's not handled because each school is handling it on its own way. The other time I attended a school management meeting, but the management there was undecided as whether to allow to obey the government directive or not. But based on what they were saying, they were not ready to welcome them into the school. They say, imagine, how can such a kid be in the school? How will other kids look at her? Automatically, though they say it's acceptable, the government allowed it, but several schools are not here to allow those kids to be in the schools. I've moved around. The other time I was in Namaingo, I went to Kumi, I moved around. I did not see any pregnant kid in the school. Not because they are not there, but because they were not welcomed in the school. You remember, teenage pregnancy, or a kid to go to school when she's pregnant is something new. And whenever something new comes in,
there's a bit of hesitation.
Yes, hesitation, and it needs a lot of process. It needs some process like orienting the community, orienting the school to allow those kids. Because, you know, the general perspective of pregnancy of school-going kids is that once you are pregnant, that is the end of your academic life. That is the perception within the people's mind. So when the government comes out and say, let those kids go to school, there was no enforcement mechanism how they are going to enforce it. But they are not there in the schools. You remember when they were doing exams, several came, they were able to write, and others did not come. Yes. So.
All right, so from the issues that you pointed out, increased teenage pregnancy, increase of school tuition, that's been an issue that's been raised a couple of times, although to a certain extent, do you understand where the institutions of learning are coming from for them to increase their school fees? Because they've been non-operational for the longest time. It's close to a year since schools closed. How exactly did you expect them to fend for their students? And of course, with regards to other issues, how should those other emerging issues be addressed?
Being out of business, it is not a license for those school administrators or proprietor, especially private schools. Even government schools charge some money. It is not a permission or a permit for those schools to increase the fees because the pandemic affected even the parents themselves. When you increase so that you cover other expenses, other costs that you incurred because you are not in business to a parent, that is not fair. As an organization, we look at it as there. So the best way to address this issue, let the government revise or reverse its directive of saying that the school should be either day or boarding. Let us go back to our usual way of learning. Let the school be both. Let it be boarding as well as day, as it used to be the status quo.
If I may, wouldn't you feel like there's a bit of a contradiction there? Because if we're living in a new normal, the new normal is that things cannot go back to the way they were. If students are if they mix day and boarding school students, those in boarding school are at higher risk of catching the coronavirus, given that those that are in day keep oscillating between school and home, and in between you don't know what they encounter. Do you not think that will then increase the number of infections, thus putting more children and students at risk?
As per the first children to go back to school, the candidates, the Minister of Education did some research, but it didn't come out with any information showing that because of these kids are back at school, now the cases of coronavirus has increased. And we didn't find any school that has a very serious issue of coronavirus because the kids are back to school. So, as you all are aware, the best way to fight this pandemic is to ensure that there is the observance of the SOP. Let these schools allow day and boarding, but make strict observance of the SOP. Let those kids come with a mask, social distancing, and all the other measures as you know them, as they were put by the government of Uganda. Possibly maybe another issue is to regulate. Let the government come up with effective regulation of the fees. As an organization, some time back, we went to Parliament and we petitioned on this issue of the fees. You know, each school charges depending on the way it wishes. You just wake up one morning and it increases what? The fees. So we petitioned the Parliament. As you know, Ugandan things don't move very fast. We haven't got a very concrete response. But let the government come up with a standard on how the school should regulate, should charge fees. Because being poor doesn't mean I'm supposed to go to the poorest school. There are schools you could admire to learn to, but because of the fees. So the issue of fees, government should come out and regulate it. Also increase funding for UPE. All the schools I went to as a community outreach officers, we did not find a school which is contented with the amount of money they give a kid. You know now it is 14,000 per kid per year. But you find a school like Kaderin in Kumi there, it has an enrollment of 600, but you find that it receives UPE money, which is equivalent to kids of 300 pupils. And even this 14,000 is not enough. So our suggestion is, let the government increase this money to enable schools be able to handle a number of its expenses. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the issues that you pointed out that has emerged greatly is during the lockdown, there were a high number of teenage pregnancies. And of course, that in a way led to a lot of school dropouts. So what could be the possible suggestion to secure the academic life for some of these young girls, given that, you know, they got pregnant at an early age, and then you've pointed out that there are some institutions that have refused to allow them return so they can commence with their education?
Okay, thank you very much. That's a very good question. First of all, I agree with the government of coming up with a directive allowing pregnant children going back to school, though at the moment it's still very difficult. Even themselves are shy to join other people, as their colleagues to school. So we agree with that. So let the government continue with that directive. But that directive still needs some enforcement. As I've told you before, that some schools do not accept. Though they don't do it direct, but the condition, the circumstance they put around. Like at that meeting I attended, we were trying to discuss this matter of teenage pregnancy. They said, how can a kid be with a pregnancy among his colleagues? First of all, it takes a very bad message to other colleagues, but it's okay. Even if you are pregnant, you can still go back to school. So indirectly, they are pushing them away. But still, the community perspective, they know once you are pregnant, you are done. So this issue needs a lot of enforcement. Let the district education officer and other law enforcement personnel at least come up to enforce this one, to ensure that they follow up with the issues. For us in the schools we went to, we were able to find out how many kids you have, how many didn't turn up, why did this one come? Because it's pregnant. Should use the same method to go and find out where those kids are so that they see that they are back to school. That's another one. Then also train teachers. You remember, this is something new, people to study with their pregnancy. Let the government come up with the arrangement of training teachers on counseling. You know, these kids, they don't get pregnant because they want, but out of peer influence, out of adolescence, that's how they get pregnant. So they get traumatized a lot. Let the government at least come up with an arrangement to see that they have counselors in each and every school. I know the government will never fail. The government has the capacity of doing very many things. It just delays, especially where its interests are not yet addressed.
All right, so let's look at the fact that government had suggested to bail out private schools from the debt incurred from COVID-19. As ISER, what is your view on this matter?
Even the other time I heard the president talking, re-emphasizing it, saying they are finding ways of bailing out schools because of the loss they incurred during the lockdown. As ISER, an organization, we disagree with that. You remember, once you start a school, that is a private business. It is your personal business. It doesn't mean schools were the only who were affected by COVID-19. Even a shopkeeper, even a trader in Chikubo, everyone was affected. Why should they bail out only the private school proprietor? And secondly, as you know what's happening in Uganda, we are not sure as to whether this money will reach to all the schools. Once it comes out, you will find out that this money will end up to a few pockets for a few schools that are owned by the big wigs within the government. So we disagree with that one. Let them improvise means of recover from the loss instead of the government bailout, and let the government use that money, equip properly its schools. Let there be SOPs, let there are enough equipment, let there are enough teachers, everything. Once government schools have everything, they will be able to perform better. They will also attract other students to come and join those government schools.
All right, so let's look at the fact that the Ministry of Education and Sports, in your opinion, do you think that it is doing enough and doing its work in addressing the challenges brought about by COVID-19?
The ministry, since the outbreak of the pandemic, has been one of the ministries on the front line of fighting this scourge. But maintaining the status quo, trying to see that there is a quality education. Education is still accessible. Education is still affordable. it has fallen short somewhere. You know? You remember the government, they had come out with the arrangement of giving out continued learning material, sending papers, and also learning on TV, learning on radio, using radios. But it fell short of that because most of the material did not reach several areas, especially in rural areas. I was in Kayunga when they were distributing those materials. There are villages which had never seen them. They say, what's happening? We don't know them. And in areas where they received them, there were very few. They just send a copy to local council one, where each parent go and photocopy. And to make matters worse, the papers they sent there, they are very bigger one. That cannot fit in most of our photocopiers we have. So most of the parents ended up not able to get those things, including myself. I also have kids, but I did not get those materials. I provided my own way from the papers and so on, so that to keep my kid very busy. Yeah. And also, where it failed, compromising. It compromised the provision of inclusive education. You remember, if you send out papers, and I'm blind, I cannot see, how do I read them? If you are teaching on TV, how do I listen when I can't hear? So which means there was some problem there. But when we contacted them, they say, you know, this was abrupt, and this is a lesson to the ministry. At least always to be creative and come up with a arrangement, always to be ready for such emergencies. At least to come up with a meager amount of money that can handle emerging issues, unexpected. Yes. And also, communication. I've never seen them on NBS here. They would be frequenting here to explain. They should be doing it as Tedros does with the WHO. Where there is a pandemic, the ministry concerned should always come out and always give updates. But there was a time when the parents are overstressed, the anxiety was too much because they didn't know what was going on. Should come out. I don't know whether the minister has even a spokesperson, but I think they're only waiting for the First Lady, who is also the minister, to come out and talk. So they should allow even other ministry officials to be talking about this issue. But when you go, you know, weighty, it is the minister, you know, weighty. So they are handcuffed to speak about certain issues concerning education. So they should relax who to speak to the media, who to speak to what. Because including the PS himself, could not just speak. You contact him and say, you know, wait. But finally, we are there.
All right. Finally, let's, as we wind up our discussion, in under maybe 1 minute and a half, you could let us know suggestions for school administrators to look into for the future, and of course, what you want the viewers to take home from our conversation we had. This is your camera.
This is a very big lesson to everyone, but to the school proprietors, especially private schools, even the government. This is a very big lesson. They should come up with an alternative source of money they could use for running schools. Let them start businesses, supermarkets. Those people make a lot of profits, but when they do, they inject them in their private other businesses. They buy land, they're putting up story buildings for themselves. Let them also come up with the arcades that are used that can generate money to run the schools. Also strengthen the school management committee. School management committee, it's a very powerful committee in management of the school. But most of them don't know what they are supposed to do. It is ISER has been going on training the school management committee and areas where we are able to train. At least they are good performance. They are performing better. There is improvement in school administration. There is improvement in academic performance. Also, the government should equip necessary facilities. The government has the ability. It is just delays or just neglect. So my suggestion, let the government reduce on the expenses on military hardwares and inject some money in the running of the education. Because if education is bad, even the country will be bad. If you are doubting, you go to Kalamoja where they don't care about education. You will confirm what I'm talking about. should the government compromise the quality of the education, this country will go down, because education is a key. It's a big pivotal in everything. Even you, if you had not gone to school, you wouldn't have been here. I wouldn't have been here. So there shouldn't be any compromise. So my appeal, as I wind up, as you're saying, my appeal to all the school proprietors, the head teachers, the directors, this shouldn't be an opportunity, because we are aware now their wallets and hands are inching, so that they put the entire burden, the entire losses to the parents. I want to remind them, even the parents themselves, they suffered in the same way. You squeeze them, they don't have money also. Their businesses collapsed. But if you burden them, they will end up saying, education, it's good you have studied a bit, you go and do other business, which is not right. Because employment is very important, it promotes employability, and also several other issues as you know them.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kisawuzi, all the way from ISER, pointing out a couple of issues that emerged from the phased reopening of schools for candidate and semi-candidate classes, and of course, some of the ways these particular issues could be addressed. If I may just reiterate from where he stopped, I believe there should be a point of compromise for both the schools and parents. An increase in school fees, I understand that schools were closed for close to a year, so you need to find ways of making ends meet. However, take into consideration that the parents as well were in the same lockdown with no access to income for the longest time, and they too had phased reopening. So I believe there should be a point at which, you know, we could all compromise such that the child gets the necessary education. As Mr. Kisawuzi pointed out, you cannot compromise on the quality of education, because in that sense, you then compromise on the quality of persons you have in the near future. This particular session has come to a close. Thank you so much for being part of the breakfast meeting here on NBS Television. I return with another session shortly. I am Isabella Tugume. Good morning.